Hello to everybody, and today we have a very special guest. It's Mr. Майклом Карпентером, who served as the foreign policy advisor to Vice President Biden at Obama-Biden administration, and as a director on Russia and National Security Council. Am I right?
All correct, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Mr. Carpenter works in the Pennsylvania Biden Center, and today I want to speak with Mr. Carpenter about the most hot issues now on the in the international policy. The first is Belarus, and the second is elections in the United States. So my first question, Mr. Carpenter, first of all, thank you very much that you found time. Thank you so much.
It's great to be with you.
We have on my YouTube channel, we have more than 200,000 people who are interested in the politics. So I'm sure it will be very interesting for them to listen to your opinion.
Well, it's a great opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. So the first question is about Belarus. It will be soon 1 month, like the protests after the false elections in Belarus began. And the situation now, what is your estimation and what is your prognosis? What will be next?
So the protest movement, in my view, is really one of these remarkable once-in-a-generation awakenings that's both civic and national at the same time. It is a unifying force across Belarus that is bringing together both workers and intelligentsia, rural and urban folks, the younger generation and the older generation. It's really sort of cutting across all of Belarusian society and uniting them against the dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko. What I see happening is a couple of things. First, I think that the protest movement is strengthening. I also believe that in the near future, Lukashenko, possibly with support from Putin, will begin to intensify his repressive measures. He started out with very tough repressive measures. He eased up a little bit, and now I think he's reverting to very brutal tactics to try to suppress the protest movement. But what's going on behind the scenes is equally important, because I think behind the scenes what we see happening is a covert Russian attempt to influence the key security institutions in Belarus, including the BKGB, the Interior Ministry, the Armed Forces, and this plethora of political consultants, media advisors, even TV news presenters and anchors, security advisors, all being sent from Russia to Minsk to advise Lukashenko or force him, frankly, to take next steps. So in my opinion, one of the key next steps that will be engineered or staged is this sort of a dialogue that Lukashenko will seek to have with selected members of Belarusian society. And he's going to pretend this is a dialogue with the protesters. In fact, it won't be. He's going to try to marginalize the protest movement and talk only with a select group of people that the Kremlin has vetted. And I just hope that Western leaders don't fall for it.
Absolutely right. And what you told about Russian, invasion, not invasion, contamination of Belarus, I call it hybrid Anschluss, which possibly can be, because there are several scenarios for Russia. First is direct invasion, which is probably not so big chances that Putin will do it. The second is this hybrid Anschluss, when he will try maybe to change even Lukashenko to some other figure, but under absolute control of him. But the most desirable is certainly the victory of democracy and new elections, where people will, on fair elections, will decide who will rule the country. But how do you feel what can be done by international community to influence both Lukashenko and Putin, maybe even Putin more than Lukashenko, just not to go for these extreme scenarios, and maybe to begin some transit of power from Lukashenko?
Well, I think the Western community has to just speak very forcefully, support the protest movement, embrace its leaders, including Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, call for the release of political prisoners, an end to torture, an end to restrictions on journalists and media, and call explicitly and specifically for a transfer of power away from Lukashenko, a democratic, peaceful transition. A lot of Western leaders haven't said that last part. They're sort of sitting on the fence waiting to see what happens.
Exactly.
And, your previous point, I think, is very accurate, because on the same day you had Putin and Lukashenko both making reference to the possibility of new elections and constitutional changes, which suggests precisely that Putin wants to achieve this creeping, slow annexation, primarily economic annexation of Belarus, which he's been after for years now. And he sees Lukashenko weakened, and so this is a great opportunity for him to try and pressure him to realize that. At the same time, I don't think he's going to give up Lukashenko anytime soon. Eventually he may sort of force him into a quasi-Nazarbayev-like retirement, but that's years down the road. So I think for the Western leaders, it's very important to demonstrate solidarity, to put in place sanctions just on the regime, not economic sanctions on Belarus, but just on the regime, and the mid-level also, the mid-level agents of repression who need to know they can't travel to the West, they can't invest in the West. And then finally, I think, the West ought to put on the table a set of economic incentives so that if there is a democratic transition, the people of Belarus know that the West will support it economically. And so far, nobody has done that, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you. You're exactly right. And my second question is very much connected because it's also about the same part of the world. It's history about poisoning of Mr. Navalny, possible poisoning. Now he is in Berlin. And how do you feel? First of all, why do you think? Because there are several versions. One of them is that it's done by Putin's regime because of Belarus events, because he's frightened with what he saw in Minsk. And maybe he wants to try to cut everybody from the field, opposition. Or maybe there are other versions, maybe, your versions of what had happened, and what can be consequences for the Russian Federation.
Well, I think it's clearly a poisoning, and in a sense it doesn't really matter whether it is connected to events in Belarus or not. It is a poisoning at the hands of the Putin regime. And obviously Alexei Navalny was the most popular opposition leader in Russia, and he had exposed massive amounts of corruption at the top, including former Prime Minister and former President Medvedev, Putin himself, and people very high up in his entourage, so including Yevgeny Prigozhin. So he had a lot of enemies in the political elite within the presidential administration. And so they reacted by trying to eliminate him, by trying to kill him. And I think the consequences should be very severe. I think Western countries should not tolerate this. I think they need to make clear that there will be consequences, sanctions, or perhaps other types of consequences that are asymmetric for this type of behavior. Because otherwise the Kremlin thinks that it can get away with continuing with these sorts of actions. And we've already seen so many of them. An attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in the United Kingdom, the murder of a Chechen dissident in Berlin, and so many others, so many others that are perhaps less well documented or less famous cases. In Kyiv, people shot down Denis Voronenkov and others in broad daylight, shot down. So there have to be repercussions, otherwise the Kremlin will keep going.
Do you know about any results of Mr. Bigen's visit to Moscow?
I don't, but I don't expect that someone at Steve Bigen's level, a deputy secretary of state, is going to make a whole lot of progress on this or any other issue. Frankly, it takes economic pressure to change the Kremlin's calculus, Putin's calculus, and even that does not happen overnight. Even that takes months, if not years, to gradually have an effect. So Bigena, can engage in diplomacy, but given that his boss, President Trump, thinks that Putin is, and I'm quoting now, a terrific guy, I don't see any scope for change. Trump has tolerated all of Putin's revanchist, aggressive actions over these last 4 years and has not had one single critical word to say about it. So nothing is going to change as a result of this diplomacy.
About sanctions, we already mentioned them in the case of Belarus, in case of Navalny. I read your amazing article. I will put a link to this article under the video for everybody who are interested in. about your view to the sanctions against Russian Federation and Putin's regime. And it was very, I don't know, your article, it was for me the first time I saw some systematic thing about how it can be done to really move Russia to changing of their behavior. And this your idea of Goldilocks principle, yeah, that the sanctions should be just enough to change their behavior, and they are not enough like we see it now. And your big aspect on financial freezings and financial sanctions on Russian banking system. Can you say a little more about it? And maybe, I mean, from the time it was you wrote the article, maybe you changed some views, or maybe you view some, now you have some other ideas about this system of sanctions which are changing the behavior of Russian Federation, of Putin.
Well, I continue to think that the sanctions that Western countries have put on Russia are just minuscule, a drop in the bucket compared to what we potentially could do. And if you compare the sanctions that have been put in place on Russia versus the sanctions that the international community put on Iran, particularly in the period from roughly 2012 until 2015, they are just drastically different sets of measures. In the Iranian case, the sanctions were so thorough that you saw a decline of GDP of about 9% a year, and oil production down from 2.2 or 2.5 billion barrels per day, million barrels per day, down to 1.1. So less than, about a 60% decrease. In the Russian case, we're talking about minor sanctions, nothing even remotely comparable to that. And no one wants to cause a collapse of the entire Russian economy and a contagion effect in Europe. But there is so much room to do more than we have so far. And the financial sector is the most obvious sector where especially the dollar is king, and where the United States could even act unilaterally if it wanted to. Now, I think it's better to act in concert with our European partners, but we have so much scope for taking action on our own that would really apply significant pressure on the Kremlin and really cause the Kremlin to think hard about its decisions about keeping forces in the Donbass, interfering in Ukraine, interfering in the elections of Western countries. So bottom line is I stand by the paper, and I think we can do a lot more than we have.
Yeah, I just added that also for Ukraine is a very important question, is annexation of Crimea, and you're exactly right, that can be done more. And in this, moving from this point, now we will have new presidential elections in the United States on November 3, and so it's very close, just 2 months left. And you're like a person who worked many years for Mr. Biden, and who now is working, as I understand, in the team of Vice President Biden. Do you feel that the attitude of Biden and Harris administration, in the case of win of Mr. Biden, will be different from what we see now? I mean, in the question of sanctions against Putin, actions in the Eastern Europe, interfering in the democracy in Western countries, and so on.
Well, first of all, I am actually not a member of the campaign staff, so I can't speak for the Biden campaign, but I have worked with Vice President Biden in the past. And so what I can tell you is, I can't think of two more diametrically opposed administrations than a future Biden-Harris administration and the current Trump administration. As I said before, Trump has called Putin a terrific guy. He has agreed with Trump and disputed the results of his own intelligence community regarding Russia's meddling in our democratic elections. And he has referred to Crimea as historically Russian territory that ought to be Russian. He has intimated that Russia was correct in annexing Crimea. Biden believes in none of those things. He sees Putin for what he is, which is a kleptocratic authoritarian. He believes we have to take measures to impose costs when the Kremlin violates other countries' sovereignty, including our own, and that we have to operate from a position of strength where we have to have the potential to be able to inflict both military and economic damage, but where we remain united. And this is the crucial part, where we remain united with our allies and our partners in Europe. So Biden recognizes we can't achieve our goals unless we're in sync with allied countries and we're working together with them. And here you have Trump, who, you know, is withdrawing troops from Germany, is insulting Chancellor Merkel, has suggested that the U.S. could withdraw it from the NATO alliance, has also suggested that we may not defend other allies in the event of a conflict. I mean, it's just terrible stuff that has completely taken a wrecking ball to the transatlantic relationship. You know, a Biden-Harris approach is the exact opposite. It's to strengthen the transatlantic relationship. So, you know, there's plenty of contrast here for voters to see.
There is no just like words, but that the United States, partly we can say, left the world stage. And can we just really wait for and believing that Biden-Harris administration will get the United States back to the world stage?
Yeah, I think absolutely we have to be engaged in the world, especially, you know, in the year 2020, where so many phenomena that we see, from COVID-19 to international terrorism to Russia and China, require collective action. And it's just crazy that the Trump administration would withdraw from the World Health Organization at a time where we're in the middle of a global pandemic. It's so irresponsible. It's so stupid. Nobody thinks that the World Health Organization is perfect, and yes, it's made mistakes, but now's not the time to abandon it. And the same goes for other international organizations. But some organizations like NATO are working very well. And yet there was a moment, according to John Bolton in his book, and it's also been reported by the New York Times, that he was on the verge of withdrawing the United States from NATO. I mean, so irresponsible. So yes, I think the U.S. in a Biden-Harris administration will be back at the seat at the table. It will take a leadership role, but it's going to have to repair a lot of damage that was done over these last almost 4 years.
I had a great possibility to see Mr. Biden here in Kiev during one of his visits as a vice president to Ukraine, and also I was a member of the parliament when he made, and now I am like my second term, it was my first term, when he made his very strong speech in the Ukrainian parliament, and I remember this. And now the question is that we see some tries to use Ukraine against Mr. Biden. I mean, you know about these tapes, so-called, which are distributed by another Ukrainian MP who started in the KGB high school in Moscow, Mr. Derkach. And how do you think it is Russia trying to interfere to American elections through these kind of tapes and things, or is it something separate from this?
Well, whether it's Russia or whether it's a pro-Russian group of oligarchs and politicians in Ukraine, it doesn't really matter all that much. But the bottom line is that, as you yourself has pointed out, people like Andrei Derkach have a pedigree that goes back to the KGB, so we know exactly who stands behind these sorts of disinformation actions. The good news is that they are falling flat. No one is falling for this crap in the United States. They see it as a blatant attempt to interfere politically, but it continues to spew forth, and that is damaging, because it also it paints Ukraine, or at least a certain portion of Ukrainian politicians, in a certain light, in the light of folks who are both peddling clear disinformation and who are trying to interfere in another country's election.
And we saw the last statement of Nancy Pelosi and the head of the Intelligence Committee of the Congress about the situation with possible interfering to American elections from Russia, and about briefing, not briefing Congress about this from the intelligence service. And can you say us more about this? Do you see the real threat that Russian interfering to American elections can be fruitful?
Well, Russia interfered very strongly, in the last election. We now know that Konstantin Kilimnik, who was the #1 business partner of Paul Manafort's in Ukraine, was a Russian intelligence agent. Up until the Senate published its report on the 2016 active measures campaign by Russia, a lot of people suspected that Kilimnik was an intelligence agent, but they didn't have proof. There was a line, I think, in the FBI documents that said that he had ties to Russian intelligence, but people really weren't sure what that meant, to have ties. Well, now it seems that the Senate report says very clearly he is a Russian intelligence agent, period. And so that definitive conclusion in the Senate's report shows you just how closely linked up Russia was in the Trump campaign in 2016. And obviously the Russians are trying to influence this campaign as well. I think less successfully. I think a lot of the disinformation that's coming this time around is being treated as such. A lot of the media, a lot of the voters see it as a blatant attempt to try to influence the outcome, and it's not credible. It's just, Biden was fighting the anti-corruption fight in Ukraine, and he was doing it alongside so many other people, including the European Union and the IMF. The actions that he took could not possibly have been anything but anti-corruption actions. And so this effort now to try to twist things, maybe it's clever. I kind of see it as a failure, to be honest.
Yeah, and we saw last documents that Mr. Kilimnik was trying to push through Paul Manafort to Mr. Trump, to President Trump, the plan of impeacing of Eastern Ukraine, and this plan was absolutely pro-Russian, just to make elections now, to legitimize Russian proxies on Donbass, and then to take off sanctions from Russian Federation because of this, and just to make some autonomous republic Donbass with the head of former President Yanukovych, who ran away. So it's something incredible.
That's right. And Ukrainians need to remember that in the spring of 2017, right after Trump was inaugurated as president, his administration tried to inquire with the State Department about what needed to be done to remove all sanctions against Russia. And when people in the State Department heard this, they panicked and they immediately started telling members of Congress. And Congress passed a law, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that required that Trump could not lift sanctions against Russia without Congress's approval. That's how scared they were. And that bill passed, I think, 493 votes in the House, which is incredible, and with something like 98-2 vote in the Senate. So very, very broad support for preventing Trump from taking this action. But we shouldn't forget that this is what he wanted to do. He wanted to lift sanctions on Russia very early on in his administration. Yeah, as far as your question with the briefings, it's incredible. The Director of National Intelligence has refused in-person briefings on the threat that Russia poses to the U.S. election, which is just a clear dereliction of duty. This is something that members of Congress need to know.
Thank you so much. I appreciate very much the time that you devoted to me and my subscribers. It will be very interesting for Ukrainians just to hear, and not only Ukrainians, we have Russians, Belarus people also, and to hear your position on it. So thanks again for your strong position, and I hope we will meet again.